I've never played golf before, but this Sunday I'm playing for the first time and I think I am going to win. I'm going to beat every single player, no matter how experienced they are, when I show up and play golf. You know why? Because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Hey, I'm Josh, and this is Understanding the Bible. And you know what? I just terribly misquoted the Bible right there. I hope it was pretty obvious. I'm not really going to win golf this weekend because that's not what this passage, Philippians 4:13, is really saying. But why is it so easy to misunderstand this? Because it does sound, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It sounds like I can do anything I set my mind to. What does this passage really mean? How can we avoid misunderstanding things? Here's the trick. Make sure to use context. When you take things out of context, it's very easy to misunderstand what they're saying. So here is a 3-step plan. We're going to walk through it with this passage, but you can use this for any passage that you think is difficult to understand or maybe is being misunderstood. And we're going to start by looking at the specific book itself. The Bible isn't just one book that was written by one author, but rather a compilation of many different writings in different styles, at different times in history, with different purposes. So we're going to look specifically at this book, Philippians, and see what it's about. So I'm going to use the NIV Study Bible and just look at the introduction to Philippians. If you have a study Bible, it'll probably have something like this at the beginning of the book as well. We see that the author is Paul, and that the audience was believers at Philippi, a prosperous Roman colony. See when it was written, and that Paul is encouraging Christians to live joyfully in all circumstances. Now, this next piece is going to be really informative. It's going to tell us that Paul wrote the letter from prison. This is really important because if we're going to understand this idea that the passage means we can do whatever we set our mind to. We can be successful at anything we want as long as we trust in Jesus. The fact that Paul wrote this from prison might say that we're a little off. Prison may look a little different for Paul than we're thinking. He was in his own rented house, so he wasn't in like a typical prison as we think of it, but he had guards guarding him, and he was in prison, not free to go. And so that means he would also have to pay for everything himself. So they weren't like paying for him while he was there. He had to take care of himself while he was in prison. And then it tells us Paul's primary purpose was to thank the Philippians, the people, the church from Philippi, for their gift that they had sent him when they learned he was in prison. But in this letter, he also encourages them about some of the challenges that they're going through as well, such as persecution that they're facing, some disunity within the church, and even false teaching. So what we have here in this introduction is Paul writing from prison to a church in a prosperous place that is going through persecution themselves and has struggles and conflicts within it. We have two extremes, two different types of things, right? We have prosperity around Philippi, but also struggles and challenges like prison. And so that is the context this passage is written in, and it already tells us that Paul is not going to be saying that we can do whatever we want, right? It's not saying when life looks hard, just trust in Jesus and it'll become easy, because he's writing this from a hard place to people who will be going through a hard place. Step 1 was to look at the book as a whole, and we were able to see some stuff as we did that. But step 2, we're going to read up to our passage. So we're going to skim through or read quickly. In this case, the book is fairly short, so we're only dealing with 3 chapters to read ahead of time. In a longer book, you may need to go a little faster if there's quite a few chapters. And you could do a lot of different strategies. If you're reading a historical book, like something from the Old Testament, you may want to do a timeline to see what happens leading up to your passage. You may want to write an outline to see the structure and flow. In this case, Philippians is a very short book, so I used the simplest method and I just read through and highlighted everything that I thought was related to our passage. So starting in chapter 1, I just read through. One of the first things here was highlighting this idea that even at the beginning, he's saying that he's writing to them from chains. And then he goes on to talk about why that happened and what it means. But I wanted you to know, brethren, that the things, it's a really key word. Remember, the question is, I can do all things. So what does things mean to Paul? And we have it right here. I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me. He's referring to things which have happened, events and circumstances outside his control, particularly being imprisoned. The things which have happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it became evident to the whole palace guard and to the rest that my chains are in Christ. So the things which happened to him, which were bad, ended up being useful for sharing the gospel. And more than that, it helped other people to have confidence to share the gospel as well. They became more bold. Continuing in chapter 1, Paul contrasts two kind of extremes. He talks about dying and living. And now living can be a problem for Paul because he's suffering. He's in a difficult situation. But he's willing to do that difficult thing of suffering because he knows it's a chance to share the gospel, to serve God here and now. On the other hand, dying is something that Paul could look forward to because he can be with Christ. So either one of these two things, either one of these two circumstances, Paul is willing to do it, to experience it, because he knows that it will be something that helps him experience and live for Christ. He's talking to the church in Philippi who's in a prosperous situation, and he tells them that they have been granted suffering. Not just to believe, but also to suffer. So Paul is saying that suffering is part of what the Philippian church is going to experience. In chapter 2, Paul is going to turn to some of the struggles they're facing, and disunity is one of those things. He's going to be urging them to be united. And he's going to do that by using the picture of Christ being humbled and suffering, even to the point of death on a cross. In verse 17, he uses this picture of being poured out as a drink offering. Here he talks about a friend being sick to the point of death. Why? Because of all the work of Christ, he has come close to death. So we see up to this point that there's a lot of suffering, a lot of struggle, and a lot of kind of unavoidable challenges that are going on for Paul and for the church in Philippi. In chapter 3, he's going to turn to a struggle that's going on within them. He warns them of dogs, of evil workers. They're talking about circumcision. But what he's saying is there are people within your own church who are leading you astray. So this is, again, another big challenge that they're going to be facing. As he talks about circumcision, he's going to contrast the flesh and kind of fleshly just existence with the spiritual. And so he's particularly focused on the actual practice of circumcision, but it's a picture to Paul of what's important. The things of the flesh or the things of God. And look what he says in verse 8. Indeed, I count all things loss for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, that I might gain Christ. So the picture here is that Paul is revealing what is most important to him. So when we read, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, we need to read it from the frame of mind of what Paul is trying to do. And what is he trying to do? Look at this. He is trying to gain Christ. That is his goal. And look at this. He even says that he has lost things. When he says, I can do all things, he is saying this in the context of counting all things as a loss. So when it comes to physical things, when it comes to earthly desires, he counts those as lost because his desire, what he wants to do, is to gain Christ. He says this in verse 10, that I may know him in the power of his resurrection, in the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. Paul's desire, what he's after, is all about experiencing Christ, living for Christ, being united with Christ in word, in deed, and in his heart. He encourages them to press on towards that goal. And he reminds them, again, their citizenship is in heaven. So he's again contrasting earthly desires with what God has in store for us, with God's kingdom versus human kingdom. And then as we move to chapter 4, again, Paul is talking about unity, joy, and in the context of suffering. So look at verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. So he's saying when problems happen, when you have struggles, don't worry, don't be concerned, but instead turn it over to God, asking for him to help you. But look at this, with thanksgiving. So that's the attitude of thanksgiving, the attitude of rejoicing in all circumstances, not just when things are going well. And so that brings us to our verse. This is where we're at. And we're going to skip to the final section. So we've looked at the big overview, we've read up to our passage, and now we're going to look in detail at the passage itself and try to make sure that we can understand what it's saying and what it's not saying. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again. So this section here, Paul is thanking them for their gift. This is his way of saying it, that they have cared about him and that it has flourished by them providing some care and support for him. Though you surely did care, but you lacked the opportunity. So he's recognizing even when they weren't giving him anything, they still cared for him. You know, you don't have to be able to provide help to be caring. You can care just in your spirit, and Paul recognizes that and is thankful for it. Not that I speak regarding to need. In this section, Paul is going to contrast two ideas. So there's this idea that he could be saying, I really needed this and you met my need. But he's saying, no, that's not what I'm saying. I appreciate it because it was generous and kind and it shows me your heart. But even if you had never given it to me, I didn't need that. I appreciate it, but it wasn't a need. For I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Remember how things were about states, they were about circumstances. So whatever state I am, these are the things he's talking about. For I know how to be abased, how to be put low and have very little. And I know how to abound, how to be full of, everything I need. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and hungry, both to abound and suffer need. Paul is saying that he can do all of these situations. He can do not having enough, suffering need, and he can also do abounding and having more than he needs. He can do being full, and he can do being hungry. He can do all of these things through Christ who strengthens him. The reason for this is because Paul's goal is not to have a lot. Paul's goal is not to be successful by worldly standards. Paul's goal is to know Christ, and you can know Christ in any circumstance, whether it's good or bad, because Christ can give you strength in those circumstances. So this Sunday, I'm playing golf for the first time ever, and I know what's going to happen. I'm going to lose, probably terribly. But guess what? I can do that thing. I can do losing well through Christ who gives me strength. And I can be a blessing and encouragement to those around me and share God's love through my losing. But somebody's going to be really good. They're going to have worked at it and they are going to just dominate the course. And they can do that thing, winning the golf game. They can do that well too. And they can be a blessing and encouragement to those around them. They can share Christ's love through their winning. So in all things, winning or losing, success or failure, having a lot or having a little, in all things we can experience God and share God's love with other people through Christ's strength at work within us.